Tonight, arraigned again. Former President Donald Trump appears in another city at another courthouse, facing even more federal criminal charges. Plus, transcript released. Hunter Biden's business partner reveals new details on Biden family business dealings. And gas prices on the rise, heading into the tail end of the summer travel season. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Former President Trump back in Washington to face criminal charges. Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Jenna Browder. An unprecedented day in our nation's capital. The 45th president was arraigned this afternoon in a D.C. courtroom on charges he tried to overturn the 2020 election. And there could be more federal criminal charges for Trump, with a Georgia case also involving the 2020 election and another in Florida that has to do with classified documents. But tonight, the focus is here in Washington, and that's where we begin with CBN News White House correspondent Abigail Robertson. Abigail?
Well, Jenna, a truly historic day as former President Donald Trump arrived at the same D.C. courthouse where many convicted Capitol rioters have been prosecuted and sentenced for their role in the January 6th attack. Cameras have been following Trump's journey to D.C. today since around 1 p.m. when he left his New Jersey golf club for the airport. Before he took off for Washington, Trump was firing off commentary on Truth Social, telling his followers, "I need one more indictment to ensure my election," and claimed Biden and his family steal millions and millions of dollars, including bribes from foreign countries, and I'm headed to D.C. to be arrested for protesting a crooked election, unfair venue, unfair judge. Trump arrived at the D.C. federal courthouse with his lawyers a little after 3 p.m., and special counsel Jack Smith was also inside the courtroom. The arraignment was mainly just procedural and was expected to include Trump's arrest and fingerprints, followed by the former president pleading not guilty to the following charges.
In the 45-page indictment, Trump faces 4 felony counts: conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. For now, Trump is the only defendant, although it's possible others could face charges, including 6 unnamed co-conspirators. 4 have since been identified as lawyers Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Sidney Powell, and Kenneth Chesebro. Smith alleges these players assisted Trump in his criminal efforts to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 presidential election by creating fraudulent slates of electors in 7 states. The next moves would be hoping to convince state legislatures, Congress, and Vice President Mike Pence that there were legal pathways to blocking Joe Biden's election. Prosecutors claim Trump knowingly tried to make false claims appear legitimate, thereby creating an intense atmosphere of mistrust and anger, leading a large group of Trump's faithful followers to attack the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
This is Trump's 3rd arrest in 4 months, and he's facing 78 criminal counts across the 3 indictments, with more expected to come. Jenna?
All right, Abigail Robertson, thank you very much. And for more on this, we're joined by Dr. John Weil, Dean and Professor of Political Science and Constitutional Law Scholar with Middle Tennessee State University. John, welcome. So talk to us about the judge in this case. We know she's taking a hard tack against the January 6 rioters. How do you expect her to rule here?
You know, we don't get to choose, or defendants don't usually get to choose a judge in a case. It appears as though in the Florida case that he might have it, he has a judge, I believe, that he appointed. This one is one, I believe, that Obama appointed. She has taken a fairly hard line with the protesters, the violent protesters in D.C. But judges are sworn like other officials, and particularly to uphold the Constitution, and one would hope that that's what you would do.
The Trump defense team actually wants this trial moved to West Virginia. They say the judge, they won't get a fair trial with the judge, with the jury, D.C. being a very liberal city. How likely do you think that is?
Probably not very likely. There are a lot of mechanisms under the law, particularly, there are unlimited number of challenges for calls, and there's also peremptory challenges. So I think that a judge, anyone, would be very alert to any signs of, prejudice, someone who would automatically vote for or against charges for Trump. And I think those mechanisms were probably sufficient.
Yeah. What do you make of this freedom of speech defense that the Trump team is talking about?
Well, freedom of speech is very important. I contribute regularly to a First Amendment encyclopedia that's online, and I actually wrote an article on it today. Speech is protected. Action is, illegal action is not. One could, say it's a shame all politicians don't just drop dead. It'd be another thing to hire a hitman. And the emphasis in this indictment, in fact, there's an early paragraph in which it says the defendant has a right, like every American, to speak publicly about the election and even to make false claims. The emphasis here is not on speech, it's on actions. It's on conspiracy, it's on obstruction. So I don't think there's much to the argument, although, it's probably as good an argument as can be made given what appear to be the facts.
Yeah, it's a complicated, layered case. Yes. What about this slate of electors charge? Can you explain that to us? And also, does it have any merit in your view?
I think it does. In other words, what happens, the way presidents are chosen is through the Electoral College. Each state selects slates for one or the other candidate. And the charge here is that knowing that the regular electors were pledged to vote for the popular vote winner in the state, who in the contested states was Biden, that knowing this, Trump and his co-conspirators worked to create alternate slates. And what's particularly interesting about it is, and of course, I don't know whether this is factually true or not, but what is alleged is that Trump actually told the electors, we're not going to send your names forward unless there's a recount and it's found out that Trump won this state rather than Biden. Mm-hmm. And apparently, so some of them seem to be almost unwilling participants. It's like, sure, if this is what's needed for fairness, I'll do it. But he seems, and his co-conspirators seem to have done so under false pretenses.
All right, John Weil, I'm sorry we're out of time, unfortunately. John Weil with Middle Tennessee State University, thank you so much for coming on this evening.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, another bombshell in Washington this evening, this one involving Hunter Biden and his former business partner, Devon Archer. This week, Archer testified before lawmakers about Biden family business dealings. There were no cameras in the hearings, so what we heard from both sides varied widely. But tonight we have the written transcript, and with that, a bit more clarity. Dale Hurd reports.
Archer told the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability he considered Hunter Biden to be a lobbyist who leveraged a very powerful name to score millions in deals with foreign businessmen, including the Ukrainian energy firm Burisma, where Hunter served on the board of directors. Burisma was seeking protection from corruption probes and other legal problems. Here are excerpts from Archer's Monday testimony released today and edited for brevity. Representative Andy Biggs asked, when you say Biden family, I just want to get a clarification. You aren't talking about Dr. Jill or anybody else. You're talking about Joe Biden. Is that fair to say? Devon Archer, yeah, that's fair to say. Listen, I don't think about it as, Joe directly, but it's fair. That's fair to say. Obviously, that brought the most value to the brand. I think Burisma would have gone out of business if it didn't have the brand attached to it. Representative Dan Goldman asked, well, I don't understand. How does that have an impact? Mr. Archer said, well, the capabilities to navigate D.C., and I think that preserved them from a longevity standpoint. Mr. Goldman, but how would that work? Mr. Archer, because people would be intimidated to mess with them. Goldman, in what way? Archer answered, legally. Archer also testified that then Vice President Joe Biden attended dinners with Hunter Biden's foreign business associates, who wired money to Biden-associated companies. The majority counsel asked, why did Rosemont Seneca Bohai receive this $142,000 payment from Rakashev? Mr. Archer, it was a car. Majority counsel, for whose car? Mr. Archer, for Hunter's car. Then Archer was asked if Hunter Biden ever put his dad on speakerphone when he was trying to finalize a foreign business deal. Archer answered yes. President Biden has repeatedly denied ever being in business with his son or having any knowledge about his son's business dealings. Some Republicans believe the Archer testimony bolsters their case for impeachment hearings against the president, while Democrats say the testimony did just the opposite. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
All right, well, as we head into the end of the summer travel season, gas prices are back on the rise, and the record heat across the country is one reason. Soaring temperatures have increased demand for electricity, causing cooling and electrical problems at some oil refineries. This leading to delays in production and a loss of hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. The rising gas prices are also linked to OPEC cutting back on global oil distribution in an effort to hike prices. And with that, let's bring in Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst at Bankrate. Mark, great to have you with us this evening. So last year we saw record high gas prices linked to inflation. This linkage to the summer heat is a little different. Does it mean anything for the wider economy, or are these high gas prices expected to subside?
Well, good to be with you, Jenna, as always. We haven't even really gotten into hurricane season yet, and that does present some risk for our U.S. Refinery capacity and output, and we'll just have to see how that shapes up. And ironically, when you think about supply and demand for gas at the pump is really not very strong right now. So this really does show the double whammy between Gulf Coast refinery activity and what we're seeing globally. I would isolate this from inflation more broadly, even though we know that rising gasoline prices are a tremendous irritant and obviously take money out of the pocketbooks of people who need to fill up at the pump.
Yeah. You know, this week we saw the first credit rating downgrade for the U.S. since 2011. Shifting gears here, Mark, do you expect the Fitch downgrade will have a major real-term repercussions for the economy?
It seems inconsequential with respect to things like demand for Treasury bonds, the macroeconomic activity that we're seeing, as well as the global marketplace for this so-called risk-free asset is probably much more significant. And so I think that some of the issues that Fitch raised, while the timing is somewhat suspect, are legitimate concerns with respect to the lack of attention being paid to the country's fiscal position. In other words, we cannot continue to contribute to high debt and deficits as we have, and we know those have been growing. So Fitch is raising some concerns that are not surprising, but I don't think that it has any real impacts on the Treasury market because there's still plenty of buyers for the U.S. government securities.
In the time that we have left, let's talk about unemployment. Unemployment claims report shows jobless claims rising to 227,000 last week, up 6,000 from the previous week. Those numbers still near the lowest this year. What do you make of the resilient job market, Mark, in the face of continued interest rate hikes and inflation?
Jenna, you nailed it. That's the perfect word to use. The job market has remained remarkably resilient and still robust. Last week, Fed Chair Jerome Powell called the job market still very tight. With the job openings numbers we got this week, we know that there are still 1.6 jobs open for every unemployed individual. We are expecting to see moderation or weakening in hiring continue. That's a trend that's been in process so far this year after a very strong year last year, Jenna.
All right, Mark Hamrick with Bankrate. Always good to see you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
And coming up, the pandemic shut it down, but only temporarily. We take you to the first World Youth Day post-COVID, the Pope's message for young Catholics. Pope Francis is on a 5-day visit to Portugal this week to celebrate World Youth Day. The global event is held every 3 years, started by Pope John Paul II in 1986. This year's celebration in Lisbon has had to be rescheduled because of the COVID pandemic. World Youth Day is open to all young people in what the Catholic Church calls a festive encounter centered on Jesus Christ. Pope Francis kicked off this year's event telling young people, quote, "You're not here by mistake," adding that all of us were all called by our names. And here with us now is Jack Jenkins, national reporter with Religion News Service. Jack, welcome. Good to have you with us. So Pope Francis and the Vatican's work to inspire the next generation. Is that easier said than done?
Probably, yes. I think there's a lot of challenges with reaching younger Catholics, just younger Catholics across the board, particularly in the United States and other places, are not always sticking with the church, and yet there still seems to be a very vibrant young Catholic population. It's notable that the message that Pope Francis seemed to want to convey to these young Catholic audiences is one of inclusivity and openness. When he was speaking today to roughly 500,000 young Catholics in Portugal, he told them there is room for everyone in the church, and whenever there is not, then please we must make room, including those who make mistakes or fall or struggle. And later, earlier he had the same message in which he kept repeating todos, 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 all, really trying to model this inclusive vision for the Catholic Church, one that seems to really resonate with younger Catholics in particular.
Yeah, the specter hanging over the Pope continues to be the Church's ongoing clergy sexual abuse scandal. Jack, how is the Pope addressing that during his trip to Portugal?
Right. So yesterday he met with 13 abuse advisors abuse survivors in Portugal. And that happens in the aftermath of a recent report released in that country that indicated thousands of abuse cases since 1950. It's a repeated refrain that has been a part of Pope Francis's papacy. He has taken some very vocal, visible steps to address the abuse crisis. For instance, in 2019, he had a Vatican sex abuse summit in which they called for concrete measures, and that ended with a journalist actually delivering a speech to bishops that were gathering there, really taking the church to task on this topic. And even recently, sex abuse survivors were kind of in Vatican talking about the ongoing synod on synodality, this sort of potential restructuring of the power structures of the church, and how that might also help abuse survivors both report abuse and invoke accountability for those who have committed abuse. But I think one thing that has continued to be the case throughout Pope Francis's papacy is, while there has been some movement and some appeals to this ongoing abuse crisis and accountability for it, sex abuse survivors have still been clamoring for the church to do more.
Yeah. All right, Jack Jenkins with the Religion News Service. Thank you, Jack. Have a great night.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, are you getting enough rest, or staying up too late, or are you on your phone too much? When we come back, the importance of a good night's sleep and some tips to help. Welcome back. Around a third of Americans are not getting enough uninterrupted sleep on a regular basis, and that can have some very bad consequences for your health. Medical reporter Lori Johnson has some tips on how to get a good night's rest.
Scientific evidence shows that how much we sleep directly relates to our immune system function. Getting plenty of Z's helps repair just about every system within our bodies.
When people get the sleep they need, they're more productive, they're more creative, they are better partners, they're better parents, they're more empathetic, and their health is much better off, both our mental health as well as our physical health.
Most adults need about 8 hours a night to feel refreshed and ready for the next day.
And on the shorter end, like when we get less than 5 hours, that is certainly kind of a risk factor for lots of negative health outcomes.
Anxiety often creates a barrier to sleep. People who struggle with this should consider preparing for bedtime a full 2 hours before lights out. That means moving from work, news, and electronics to something more calming, familiar, and pleasant.
Oftentimes, people treat themselves like they're computers, that you can just kind of flip the off switch and then kind of go to sleep. And that's just not how the body works.
Setting your alarm clock so that you wake up at the same time every day, even on the weekends, is a useful tip to help gain control over when our body naturally gets sleepy, also known as circadian rhythm.
One of the things that happens with insomnia is that people try to kind of adjust their wake time based on how their night was, right? So like they have a bad night of sleep and they'll sleep in an extra 2 hours. But what that does is it kind of throws the whole system off. It actually kind of puts you in jet lag without having any of the benefits of traveling.
If you often toss and turn in the middle of the night, try getting up and moving to a different location like the couch. That can help your brain not associate anxiety with your bed, something called conditioned arousal.
So, you have your angstiness and your bed, and you need to break those apart. and wait until you get sleepy again. So you don't want to turn on all the lights. You don't want to do anything really active. You want to go back to those relaxing things that are known to kind of bring on that sleepiness for you. And when you begin to feel sleepy again, you kind of repair that relationship so that, over time, when you get back in bed, the bed does what it's supposed to do, is cue you to fall asleep.
Exercise during the day tends to help us sleep well. So does a dark room that's a cool 65 degrees. On the other hand, things that can get in the way include caffeine and alcohol, which can suppress important dreaming or REM sleep.
The other thing that alcohol does is it's relaxing, right? It hits on those receptors in our brain that make us feel relaxed, but it wears off. And when it wears off, your brain notices, and that also leads to more awakening.
Also, try to avoid sleep medications and other aids.
Even if many of them are not physiologically addicting, they become almost immediately psychologically addicting, right? We start to wonder, can we sleep without these? And so it's a slippery slope to go down.
Lastly, head off worrying in bed by setting aside time during the day to make a list of your problems and the first step towards a solution. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
From the bath to the bay, the yellow icon spreading happiness around the world. Still ahead on Faith Nation. Finally tonight, the world's largest rubber duck is making a big splash in Maryland this weekend. Mama Duck, as she's called, measures 6 stories high and weighs over 30,000 pounds, taking around an hour and a half to inflate. The rubber duck will be visiting the region for the first time, venturing up the Chesapeake Bay from southern Maryland to Maryland's eastern shore next weekend. Mama Duck travels all over the world and is known to draw some pretty big crowds. In 2017, nearly 1 million people came out to see her in Toronto over a 4-day span. The duck's creator says his goal is to create happiness and to spread kindness. And that's going to do it for Faith Nation this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.